First, GRE in our membership. So we are the second biggest utility in the state of Minnesota. We are geographically the largest utility in Minnesota. We have 28 member owners. And you can see we span the Arrowhead region all the way through the metro area down to around Iowa, and we even have a little bit of a load in Wisconsin. We're the fourth biggest GNT in the country. GNT is Generation Transmission Cooperative, and I will talk about that in a second. We have 3,500 megawatts of generation and almost 5,000 miles of transmission line. So we're a pretty big utility, but not as big as Excel. To put it in perspective, Excel in Minnesota has about 10,000 megawatts. Or, well, not 10,000 megawatts. Their load is 10,000 megawatts, and ours is about 2,400 megawatts. So we're large, but nowhere near the largest. Our generating resources are throughout Minnesota and North Dakota. We have our large coal generating plant, Coal Creek Station, which is in Underwood, North Dakota, kind of right smack dab in the middle. And we have Spiritwood Station, which is around Jamestown. We have a lot of wind in Minnesota and North Dakota, and all of our gas peaking plants are in Minnesota. And I'll talk about that. Who knows what a gas peaking plant is? Good, great. So I'll do another question. Who knows the difference between energy and capacity in terms of utilities? Yes. So capacity is how many megawatts of generation we have. So we're talking a coal plant. Our coal plant is 1,100 megawatts. When we're talking energy, that's like you see in your bill every month. You may use X kilowatt hours. When we're talking about energy generation, if our 1,000 megawatt coal plant runs for 1 hour, right, that's 1,000 megawatt hours. So it's just power over time. Our capacity is how large is your portfolio? So our coal is 37% of our portfolio, and that's coming really from one unit, and that's at Coal Creek Station, 1,100 megawatts. Our natural gas peaking plants are all throughout Minnesota, about 1,400 megawatts of that, 15% renewable by capacity, 6% hydro, and a small amount of fuel oil that we have in our portfolio too. I'll kind of run through this a little bit, but we're 25% renewable energy in 2017, and we're consistently working with our membership, Mille Lacs Electric Cooperative here in this area. Everybody a member of a cooperative? Your electric cooperative, most of you, yeah. A lot of our electric cooperatives if you ever see their headquarters, you'll see a little solar array right up front. And that was kind of one of the projects that we worked with our members and owners on to put solar in and start learning a little bit more about it. It's kind of when solar was first starting to pick up in the state. We began working with our membership on that, and we continue to procure wind. So just a quick overview of the electric system. Generation, power is generated. It's your coal plant, your gas plant, your wind generation. Then transmits the power over the transmission system into a substation, then steps it down into distribution and into your house. At a very high level, this is how the system works. We have PPA up there, power purchase agreement. So whether you own the plant or whether you buy the energy from a third party. So for example, we do that with wind. So we'll go out and we'll work with a developer like a Next Era Energy, and we'll say you have a 200 or 300 megawatt wind project. We want to take the energy out of that project, so we'll sign a power purchase agreement with them. And so it's going to flow just like a generation would. It just looks a little bit different on the books, and we don't own the asset. But PPAs are extremely common in wind, and I can talk about that here in a little bit too. And it has a lot to do with the production tax credit that utilities with tax appetite can take advantage of. Vertically integrated utilities are the Xcel Energies, the Otter Tail Powers, and Minnesota Powers. They own their generation, they own their transmission, they own their distribution. It's all vertically integrated under one company. Cooperatives like Great River, we're a little bit different. We own the generation, we own the transmission, and then that's kind of where it stops. We work with our member owners. The member owners have the distribution system, and they have power purchase contracts with GRE to take power from us and transmission service from us to serve their distribution load on their systems. So, types of generation. Baseload generators are coal plants. They're nuclear plants. They're large hydro, like Manitoba Hydro, if you ever hear of those. If you see the big, if anyone's ever been up to Duluth and you see the big dam up there, it's large hydro. It's very low operating cost. but it comes at a trade-off because it's a very high capital cost. The initial investment to get one of these units up and running is extremely high. So you're looking at a nuclear plant. There aren't a whole lot of nuclear plants being built in the country. Same with coal. And there are a couple of different reasons behind that, but one of those is the high capital costs to get one of them in the ground. Once you get it in the ground though, it's really, really cheap to operate. Very low operating costs. Hydro, nuclear, almost zero operating costs. Coal, you're really just looking at fuel deliverability. Very low operating costs to keep them running once they're in the ground. An intermediate generator is a natural gas combined cycle unit. So it's kind of the next step down. It's not as expensive to put in the ground, but it's not as cheap to run. They run a little bit less than baseload. Baseload generators are typically running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, with some, exceptions for outages and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit about our coal unit and the experiences that we've had in ramping it, taking it on and offline and stopping and starting it for a number of reasons. But intermediate generators have medium operating costs, hours, and capital costs. And then peaking generation. So peaking generation is a very small gas combustion turbine. They don't run much. Annually we see our combustion turbines running 2, 3, 4% of the time. And that's because they're really only needed when the system is stressed. They're very expensive to run, which means that our cost to operate these units is quite high. So the only time that we're going to run them is when the market sends us the price signal that the system is stressed, we need energy resource, here's the cost of energy, and then our units kick on. So summers when it's 110 degrees, winters when it's -40, right? That's when we're seeing peaking units run. You don't see combustion turbines run a lot. Diesel generation, most people here that have been around farms, they may see diesel generation, right? A diesel genset on your farm. It's the same kind of concept. It's providing headroom to the system, it's providing capacity to the system, but it's not really providing the energy to the system until the system needs it. And when it needs it, it's there. And I didn't include anything about markets in this presentation because we could talk about energy markets for a whole other hour. But suffice to say that we submit all of our generation into the market on a day-ahead basis with an offer price, essentially what it costs us to run. And the market tells us whether it's going to run or not, based on the price that they're forecasting in the market that day. The same thing with these peaking generation. We say, these are expensive for us to run, so here's our cost. When the market hits a price that these units can run, they'll run in the real time, or they may get picked up in the day ahead if we see that it's going to be 100 degrees outside. So they don't run often, but when they do, they're certainly needed. Now, other types of generation, renewable generation. They operate when, and I say, quote, fuel is available. So when the wind is blowing, when the sun is shining, run-of-river hydro, same when there's an available resource. That's when they operate. They're constrained to operate in a non-dispatchable manner. And that's one of the challenges that we see with renewable generation. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that soon. So this is dispatch, and this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. You can see here on this curve, this is a hypothetical dispatch curve, and if you can see at the very bottom end there, the green and the purple and the blue is renewable nuclear hydro. These are the assets that don't cost a whole lot to run. So when they're being submitted into the markets, when they're running, these are the first things that are coming on the system. So the system capacity available, this demand along the bottom here. What this is essentially telling us is that in the early morning hours at that 60 to 80 to 67 gigawatts, the assets that are serving that are on the left, and it's predominantly renewables, nuclear, hydro, and coal. When you get over to this other line, the 114 gigawatts, afternoon on a hot day, that's where you see the natural gas, the peaking units kicking on. So these units cost more, but when the system needs them, this capacity needs them, they come on to serve load. So this is what's called a dispatch curve. The more expensive generation is, it's not going to run until the system starts getting up there in terms of cost and necessity. Our load shape is important to understand too, and everybody's load shape. So This is our hourly load curve over the year, and you can see that we're a summer peaking utility. We have the highest load on our system is in June, July, August, and that's during the summer. It's very common in Minnesota to see perhaps a winter peak in December that may be as high, or even in some utilities' cases, higher than the summer. This is important to understand because the load shape and the load curve dictates what kind of resources need to serve them. So you can see these red lines indicate the types of resource. So the baseload resources are always on because they're needed to serve the lowest amount of demand in the system, so they're always running. When we see maybe in the shoulder months, the spring and the fall, a little bit of demand coming up, maybe we would see some intermediate generation being dispatched to serve that in the market, so gas combined cycles. Summer, it gets really hot. Load jumps up, and that's when peaking units are needed. And not just peaking units, but demand response. So demand response isn't really a generation technology, but it's something that I will talk about. And that does serve to reduce the peaks in the summer and in the high demand situations. Our utilities resource needs, you can see our load curve here. So we need all of the above. If we were serving our own our own load, we would need baseload, intermediate, and peaking resources because we have what can be characterized as a fairly residential load curve. It's high in the summer, it's low in the spring and the fall, it's higher in the winter. This reflects people's space heating and cooling, both residential, commercial, industrial. When you get into other utilities, like I'll use for example Minnesota Power, because they have a lot of mining operations in that area. That's an extremely high, what we call load factor on the industrial operations there, which means that they aren't kind of like this, right? When those mines and the operations up there are on, they're on, and they're flat. And that's providing a pretty high load factor and a pretty flat load curve. So they may not have those sags in the fall and the spring like we do, which may mean that perhaps they don't really need the same types of resources if they were serving their own load that we do. So again, depending on the type of utility really dictates the types of resources that are needed. Stepping back to a larger scale, in the US we've seen coal generation dominate for decades. Since the 50s on this chart, all the way to 2015. And all of a sudden, natural gas is now displacing coal as the most generation in the country. And the reasons for that are multiple, right? Gas has gotten really cheap. Coal is having a hard time competing in the market, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth on that in a second. We've experienced that. We retired a smaller coal unit last year, and the reasons we retired it are because of the market difficulties that coal faces today. And that's it's just a fact of life. There's no political reasons behind it. My personal opinion, there's no political reasons behind it. It's a market-driven function of what's happening with other competing resource pricing. That's as cut and dry as it gets, that the market is retiring coal. There's no other factor really at play that's driving the difficulties that are facing some of the larger scale generation. So coal, like I said, very low operating costs. Our coal unit, for example, it sits at the mouth of a mine, so it's very low cost to get the fuel there. So it has CO2 emissions. Right, and that's one of the downsides that you're going to hear a lot of people talk about, because GRE's opinion is that we're moving towards a carbon-constrained future. Whether the utilities industry likes it or not, we're more likely to probably be under some type of carbon regulation in 20, 30 years than we are less likely to be. So if you think about that, if you plan for that, coal has some challenges ahead, but for now, we still view that as an exceptional asset to our system. It's a very low-cost unit that provides great capacity and energy and helps keep our rates competitive to our member owners. Hydropower, again, it's completely renewable. The generation associated with hydro is carbon neutral, it's CO2 free. Now some people talk about that there's some carbon emissions in the construction process, but if you think about things on a life cycle analysis, it's hard to get away from CO2. But in terms of CO2 associated with energy production, hydro is about as clean as it gets. There are some issues with land use, natural resource impacts on large hydro. You've got fish issues, you've got native rights that have been mentioned in Manitoba. You know, there's indigenous people that have that maybe have taken issue with some of the things that have happened, because a lot of this hydro is in, at least that we see in Manitoba, are in those areas. So that's one maybe challenge that's faced. Geothermal right now, it's a good asset for the areas that it might be available for these smaller applications. We don't look at it really because we think bigger on the generation supply side as a larger utility. So it's not really something that we are pursuing or thinking about in the future. So it's important to talk about reliability, right? And I'm sure a lot of people will hear about reliability on the electrical system, and that renewables are impacting reliability, and to a certain extent that is true, because some of the issues that we've seen faced at the coal units is precipitated by wind. The market price is what we get for producing electricity. So when our coal plant is running 24 hours a day, we're in the mid-continent independent system operator energy market. And it works like any other market, right? We offer in our energy, we sell it to the market at the price that the energy is generated, and we get paid for the generation. What we get paid has declined in recent years a lot. It's declined 30% or more since 2010. And one reason for that is gas, because there's a lot of gas in the market, and the marginal units in the market may be gas. So the easiest way to think about it is the gas price essentially dictates the market price of electricity. So the lower the gas prices get, the lower the electricity market prices get. And when wind comes in, the production tax credit from the federal government has allowed very, very, very low wind prices, to the point where wind assets are offered into the market at negative costs. So, you know, the market price may be an average of $15, but wind might be offering in at negative $40. And there are a lot of reasons behind that, for the tax payment, the structure of the contract. But what this is doing is, when MISO, the market, sends the signal that we don't need any more energy because we don't have the load that needs to be served now, so they drop the market price down to zero. There's still a lot of stuff running at zero because wind is offering a negative. They drop it to negative 20. And that means that if our coal unit's still running, we have to pay MISO, right? We don't get paid anymore, we have to pay them. And so that market price keeps coming down, 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 until either load shows up or generation is curtailed and the market price comes back up. That theme has brought the average market price of electricity down. And so what we're able to recover from our assets has gone down a lot. It's good for buying load. So we in the market, we sell all of our generation, we buy all of our load that we need to buy. So 2,400 megawatts of load, we'll buy that every day. We sell our generation in, so it's all sell, all buy. It's great for us buying load. Don't get me wrong, you know, the lower market prices are great, but it definitely is a challenge. Those units were designed and built to be flipped on and run, and not really be messed with until they get taken out for outage and worked on. Now, we have to look at what's happening with the market price and try and understand how can we best avoid losing money. And so one of the things that we've done is to move to more flexible operations at our coal plant. So it's driven by these market changes. We can ramp a much higher range in our coal units now than we were able to before. We can ramp a 700 megawatts or more, which is a huge range for a coal plant. And this allows us to try and get out of the market when we see all this wind coming on and the market prices dropping down to zero or lower. It allows us to avoid our exposure to those low market price conditions, and that's in the best interest of our membership. And we're not the only ones. You know, there are other coal units around the country that are also starting to ramp and understand how they can try and work around a market now that is no longer based around those units like it has been in the past. I've already talked a little bit about hydro and nuclear, so I think in the interest of time, I'll probably move on from this. Nuclear obviously faces challenges in terms of fuel disposal, right? We all know that you have to cask the nuclear fuel, you have to transport it, you have to store it. There's a lot of complexity around nuclear generation, but once it's in the reactor, and once it's generating electrons, you know, it's as carbon free and as cheap to run on an operational basis as it gets. Again, there are decisions that have to be made around the country because there's a desire to move to less CO2, but there's also a desire to have no reliability impacts. Nuclear accomplishes both of those things, but there's still some resistance to nuclear in some areas, and nuclear does have very high fixed costs still, so even though the units are cheap to run on an operational basis, the total cost, the all-in cost of a nuclear unit is still quite high because of those high capital costs that I talked about earlier. Peaking assets, natural gas combustion turbines, battery energy storage. I've already talked about combustion turbines, so I will skip it because batteries are more interesting, and I think probably people would be maybe more interested in hearing about those. And demand response. So these are capacity resources. Like I've already said, they don't provide much energy, but they provide headroom to the system. Batteries are interesting. I don't think they're there yet from an economics perspective. There's a lot of perhaps exposure bias in the news because you always hear about 1,000 megawatts of batteries in Australia or this new big battery project in California. But to be fair, there isn't a whole lot of batteries on the system. You know, there's a very small amount. And the reason for that is the economics aren't there. If the economics were there, you'd see them. You'd see them all over the place. It's like any other market economics. You know, you would see them coming in, you would see them being used. For right now, the market is not constructed currently to pay us as utilities to put a battery in. There are a lot of different services that batteries can provide. They can provide capacity. They can provide transmission ancillary services, frequency voltage regulation. They can do a lot of different things, and they're great at doing them. But you need to be able to get paid for all of those, and they call that value stacking. You have to stack the values to be able to make the initial investment pay off. And currently we can't do that. You see a lot of batteries in California because they have very aggressive carbon standards. And the very aggressive carbon standards have attached a price on that, and batteries are a capacity resource that allow the carbon neutrality goals of California to kind of persist, as well as putting these batteries in the ground. And obviously the more batteries there are, the more developers come into the area, the more competition there is, the more prices fall. So it's kind of a feedback effect, and in California you actually see a lot of batteries. But one thing that I will note is that we maybe haven't seen how batteries run as a reliability asset. So like I said, they only run our combustion turbines maybe 2 or 3% of the time, but when they're needed, they run. And if they run for more than 2 or 4 hours, batteries might have a hard time, because battery chemistry, the way that it is today, is a dispatch of 2 to 4 hours. There are some batteries that can run longer than that, but for an example, we saw runs on our peaking assets earlier this year that lasted 12 hours. So for capacity purposes, it's great. But if you put batteries in the ground for capacity reasons and retire a bunch of gas turbines, and then you all of a sudden have a 110-degree day, and you need those assets for longer than they can discharge, maybe now you're in trouble. Because they're going to run out, and then they have to go into a deep discharge, or a deep recharge. And then you have to wait hours before they're available again. So unlike gas, which has a deliverable fuel in their pipeline, batteries have a finite dispatch, which is a challenge. Renewables, I think a lot of folks know about renewables. You know, there's no carbon emissions. The challenges are they're non-dispatchable. They're intermittent, right? You have to take the energy when you can get it. For us, one of the positives is that they're cheap. We can buy wind really cheap. We can buy wind for $20 a megawatt hour, which is absurd right now. You know, to build a gas combined cycle unit, you're talking maybe $150 a megawatt hour, something like that. And for coal, I don't really know a good idea for new coal, because not a whole lot of new coal is being built. But it is certainly the lowest cost resource today, wind. On the flip side, you are in a position where you've paid X amount of money for the contract, now you're locked into that if it's a PPA, and you're basically taking what the market gives you like any other generation, but the more wind that's coming into the market, the more other people are buying it, the lower those prices will get, and maybe you're upside down on it from day one, right? So it's not unique in that, I don't think, but it's just something to think about. And for solar, we're seeing a lot of solar in the state from Excel. If you're ever up by, oh man, where acres. It's up kind of just northeast of the Twin Cities. There's a North Star solar project. It's 100 megawatt solar project. It's 1,000 acres. That's a lot of land, right? So if you think about it from an opportunity cost perspective of farming and things like that, right? 1,000 acres is a lot of lost land, but it's a carbon-free resource that is fairly low cost with the tax credits. So you have your pluses and minuses with both. I've got a couple more slides here, but I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll move through these pretty quick. I did want to mention, I talked about a lot of wind coming in. This is how much. In 2000, it's hard to read. In 2004-ish, there was only about 1,000 megawatts of wind in MISO. And MISO is Minnesota down to Louisiana. And what we're talking about here is really just Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa for this. That's where most of the wind in MISO is. But we went from 1,000 megawatts of wind to 16,000 megawatts of wind in about 10 years. That's really fast growth. And it takes transmission a lot of time to get built. And that transmission is needed to get the energy out. So if the energy can't get out, then you are bottling it up and you're taking that market price and dropping it down even further. So there are challenges with this quick wind growth. And there's even more wind that's projected to come on. We see wind blowing in the off-peak times. So we see wind blowing when it's not really needed on the system. Wind blows mostly in the morning and in the evening and in the winter. And here in Minnesota, we see peaks in the middle of the day and late afternoon and in the summer. So you have annual versus daily mismatch between load and generation. And basically what that means is that maybe you need more wind. And as a result of this, MISO, the market, doesn't give us a whole lot of credit. We have to adhere to planning reserve margins. So every utility that's in MISO has to keep a certain amount of assets in the portfolio for reliable system operations, and we get credit for each one. A coal unit, we get pretty much full credit because it can run flat out, it can run all the time. Wind, we get 15% credit for. So if we buy a 100 megawatt project, we only get credit for 15 megawatts of that, maybe 25 over time as they see the production coming in. Regardless, we don't get nearly the same capacity credit that we do for wind, or that we do for other units for wind, which means that you need to buy more of it. And the more wind comes in, like we've talked about, kind of exacerbates maybe some of the pre-existing issues. But again, wind is cheap, so do it if you can. I think I've run out of time, but utility scale versus rooftop solar, that's on your roof. You want to see it on your neighbor? Maybe not. That's utility scale. Like I said, a lot of land use, right? It's fundamentally changed the way utilities have to operate in California. It's changed the load curve, right? Their most expensive time of the day now is in the evening, right? And it's because there's so much solar in the state that all the energy is coming in the system in the middle of the day, and they drop the prices down because there's so much energy, right? So it's flipped the economics of solar and market pricing. Wind, I think we've talked enough about the impact and the dispatch and how it runs, but it has created challenges to how we operate our portfolio, but it is cheap. And demand response is the last thing. Demand response is your diesel generators. It's your cycled AC programs. If you live in a utility where you can sign up for a cycled AC, what demand response is in the middle of the day, if a utility sees that it's going to be really hot and we need to reduce our peak load, we can call demand response. And it does this. The blue line that was going to be where the red line is then drops down, right? And it reduces our peak, which means over time, in the planning perspective of things, perhaps we don't need the same capacity of resources that we would have needed without demand response. Now, we have about 400 megawatts of demand response in our system, which is proportionally similar to most of the country. So we can control our peak pretty aggressively during the summers, which is great for us. And it saves us and our membership a lot of money, and it's a great business plan. But the one point that I want to leave you with here is the necessity of a diverse portfolio. You'll hear a lot about reliability, you'll hear a lot about coal getting retired, you'll hear a lot about people buying all wind. Mid-America in Iowa is buying 100% wind, right? And that's great. If they can do it, good for them. But earlier this year we had a day where it was really cold. It was negative 20 degrees. It was cloudy, so there was no solar. There was no wind, which was unusual for the winter. We had a compressor station on a gas pipeline that was delivering gas to one of our stations malfunction. So there was gas deliverability issues. So you have these events where maybe there's a time that it pays to have diverse portfolio. Without our coal unit, without fuel oil backup in our peaking units, we would have been in trouble, perhaps. We weren't, but it pays to have a diverse, it's just like investing. You're not gonna have all bonds. You're not gonna have all tech stocks. You want something that's diverse, and you need that. And you also need the spinning mass of thermal generation, and that's for transmission. Again, it's another presentation for another time, but you need spinning mass in the system to keep the transmission system operating. And that spinning mass is coal, nuclear, gas combined cycle. You know, there are some technologies that can accommodate that with wind and solar, but it's challenging. But right now, you know, for where we are today, it's important to have diversity. And I think that that's the message that we try and convey to the regulators and the folks at the state level.